Welcome to the Sheroes of Beijing Stories, the podcast series, brought to you by UN Women Nigeria and Women in Successful Careers, WISCAR. In this series, we would be sharing and celebrating stories of women's activism in Nigeria. The women in this podcast were present in the Fourth World Conference on Women, popularly tagged Beijing 1995, and their extensive and impactful experience and commitment to the empowerment of women is why we continue to celebrate them. At WISCAR, we believe in the power of a shared story in leading the next generation to aspire, grow, and contribute to nation building. We hope you will be inspired as you listen. Welcome to this episode. Amina Oyagbola, the founder and chairperson of WISCAR, will be in conversation with Professor Ayodele Atsenuwa. Professor Atsenuwa is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Development Studies at the University of Lagos. She holds an LLM degree in Law and Development from the University of Warwick and an LLM degree in Criminology and Criminal Justice from the University of London. She is a solicitor and advocate of the Supreme Court of Nigeria and a professor of law at the University of Lagos. Since 2012, Professor Atsenuwa has served as an adjunct professor on the LLM program in human rights at University of Pretoria. She has been executive director at the Legal Research and Resource Development Center, a Nigerian human rights non-governmental organization. She is a strong advocate of law reform for development and has consulted for the federal and state governments as well as various international and national organizations including UNDP, UN Women, the Ford Foundation, amongst others, on projects aimed at promoting human rights, including gender rights and development. Welcome, Professor Atsenuwa. Great to have you here with me in the studio this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and congratulations on your recent elevation to the position of Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Lagos. We indeed wish you even greater heights. So without further ado, let's get right into the conversation. The month of April, as you know, is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and this particular month is focused on raising public awareness about sexual harassment and how to prevent sexual violence. Sadly, in Nigeria, sexual harassment and discrimination is still prevalent in our academic institutions. Prof, what do you think needs to be done to address this issue?
Well, I think, first of all, let me start with a note of thanks for inviting me to be part of this and quickly go on to answer my question. I think the first thing that we need to do is to actually come to terms with the reality that the incidence level of sexual harassment and sexual assault generally is high, and that educational institutions like universities actually have structures that can lend to conduciveness of sexual harassment because of the hierarchy of relationships between students who are kind of dependent or who have a need to get something out of the institutions, and then those who hold the key to those things that the students need. The first thing we need to do once we come to terms with the reality that it happens and it is a problem we need to address is to develop a policy. In the university system, we'll call it a policy as against the law, and a policy that is all-encompassing, that reflects a zero tolerance, for such conduct. Then to build awareness around that policy. And that policy must be all-encompassing. It must have very strong processes. And of course, we need to take steps to generate confidence in the processes that are laid out in such policies by ensuring that they are workable, they're well disseminated, students are all aware of what it covers and how they are protected. And of course, to ensure that we get it right, it would always be useful to adopt a student-engaged process in designing such processes so that you can be sure that the processes you think will work are things that students actually are comfortable with. But then it's also a self-correcting system.
Yes, it is.
But in sum, what we need are processes that work. Mm-hmm. First of all, define the processes, lay them out in some policy document, then apply. The institutions must apply themselves to implementing those policies in all the ramifications.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, those are fantastic ideas and suggestions. And, I think from everything you've said, it's all about leadership and leadership from the top, setting that tone right from the top and then ensuring the cascade, throughout the entire system in terms of the PPPs that you just highlighted. I just want to segue now very quickly into, another issue on the same lines. And this is really about, the subject of feminism. And, the term feminism, often has a negative connotation in our society. And there seems to be a perception that, feminists are a group of angry women complaining about, we don't know what. So I have a few questions for you. First, Prof, what does feminism mean to you, and why should all men be feminists? And furthermore, what has motivated you to develop the gender and the law course in the University of Lagos? And, what impact has that course had in that academic institution?
Thank you very much for those questions. So what is feminism? Well, I suppose it's the historical context of the emergence of feminism that makes many people get very scared. There is some sense in which the struggles were violent. For example, if you cast your mind back to the suffragette struggles, yes. And also then in the 60s, as you had the wave of feminism in North America in particular, as, the slogans were, burn your bras and things like that. So many people tend to imagine that feminism is all about violence and upturning society. But then I always say that even those instances where women had to have recourse to violence, it wasn't really their fault. Other efforts had been made to get women mainstream, to get equality for women, and it was resisted. And it appeared like there was no other way that women get attention to some of the issues that they were raising, but to have recourse to those issues. Now, because of that, and then, we have this tendency to romanticize and to make a distinction between us and they, especially when it comes to women's lives, So the they is the West that has all these ideas that will upturn society and break down our culture, and structures. But I always say that every day society changes, and there are many areas in which we've changed, and we do not get the same kind of panic attacks, as we see, or moral panics as we see around when women make demands, when women place demands, on society to restructure, to change. So for me, feminism simply is a movement that is all-encompassing. It's encompassing of interrogating the theories, the principles that explain how society relates to men and women, and any differences or differentials that we observe. We try to understand what's playing out here. Is it just nature in quotes, or is it nurture, or is it, social arrangements? So we ask those questions. It also includes political and social action, to realize the change that we want to see, where women are not marginalized, women are not on the periphery. The truth of life is that men and women make human. Absolutely. And one is not superior to the other. Absolutely. So in asking that women be allowed to find their voice, to occupy their place, as equal citizens, as equal members of the human society, and in the context of Nigeria, of our political society, women are not asking for favors. They're not asking for anything. We're just asking for human rights. And the illustration was a time that it was thought that when women go to school, the world will come to an end and marriages will, cease to be. And there have been all those moral panics, but it's never happened. Rather, we have seen that when women go to school, the family is strengthened. The development of the family is far enhanced. So we've seen those things, contrary to what our worst fears have been in history.
Yes. So when women go to school, I mean, there's more development, there's more prosperity, shared prosperity.
Yeah.
And yes, thank you so much for your very rich insights and for, deepening our understanding. Because I think a lot of these issues and comments are really born out of ignorance and lack of understanding, which is why, the more awareness we create through platforms such as these, the better for everybody. We really must join hands together, both men and women, to ensure, equal opportunity for all human beings.
Just a minute. You did ask me the question about why did I develop the gender and the law course. Do you want me to take that?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I got into women's studies because it was just introduced. It wasn't anything that I studied in school specifically. I need to say that when I was in university, there was no gender analysis of anything. I cannot recall that in the 4-year degree program that I took in the law program, there was any analysis along gender lines.
My goodness.
So it was only when I got to my master's class and I was studying crime that I got a bit introduced to, the topic women and the criminal justice system. But then I got to work with the late Professor Jadesola Akonde, who introduced me by assigning me a paper to do once on, women and children under the law in Nigeria, and to do like a situation analysis and present a report. And that opened my eyes. And it then occurred to me that, look, except I introduced a course that actually gives students an opportunity to understand what gender as a tool of analysis is all about, and see how gender analysis can be used to strengthen law for social justice and development, then it is very unlikely that law will be able to deliver on its promises. So it was really very important for me to introduce that, because I could not trust that the courses as traditionally designed would, do all of those.
And I'm sure that, the introduction of that course has added immense value and has contributed significantly to mainstreaming gender in our environment. So thank you very much for that, Prof, that huge contribution to the gender equality fight. So we'll just segue now very quickly to the topic of gender-based violence, which, has been described as the shadow pandemic. And as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed what was beneath the surface, which also increased dramatically in the past year, very sadly. Sadly, as societal norms have not enabled the victims to get justice in Nigeria. And furthermore, African cultural and societal norms have played a part in hindering the victims from getting justice when these incidents occurred. Prof, we would like to tap into your wealth of knowledge and experience, not only as a legal expert and scholar, but also as a gender activist. What do you think needs to change dramatically to ensure that perpetrators are prosecuted and that the victims, of these actions actually get justice in Nigeria?
Okay, that's a pretty tough one, because not in terms of ideas, but in terms of the workings of those ideas of what is doable. That's because on a good day, we actually have high attrition rates when it comes to criminal investigations, generally speaking, because of the challenges that face policing in Nigeria. The combination of lackadaisical attitude, ineptitude, corruption, do not help us actually to get a good grip on the cases that are reported generally when it comes to criminal justice. But I think that what we could do also is strengthen the support to victims. It's very, very difficult for victims to sustain the demand for justice because it's usually is very delayed. All too often, they're not very aware of the workings, and no one's ever really explained it to them in such a way that they have staying power. And then you have so many things going on. So I think that we need to design, support, victim support, especially when it comes to SGBV, such and institutionalized. We need people to go to courts with, survivors in such a way that someone's explaining to them, someone's encouraging them to come back, and all of those things. Of course, we also need to design processes that are more responsive to how women relate. Now, as a teacher of law and as somebody who's worked with law for the last going on 40 years, I realized that criminal justice is not designed for, and that's what cultural feminism is all about, for example. Its principles come from a male reality.
Yes.
It assumes that you're going to be able to talk about your in quote victimization, that you can confront your assailant and all of those things. It does not have at the back of its mind the weight of stigma and all of those things, the believability. Most incidences of sexual harassment or sexual assault or SGBV generally will not take place in the public sphere. So it's usually your word against mine. How do I prove? So that is a challenge. And I have said to some of my colleagues, we need to sit down and we need to begin to evolve what principles, how are we going to extricate, gender-based violence, SGBV, from the mainstream, the traditional principles. Should we? And if we should, how do we do it in such a way that we balance justice for both the accused as well as the survivor? So that is something we will definitely need to work on. And I think the other thing that I will just say also is that we need to begin to help survivors recognize that criminal justice is not the only way they can get justice. There's also civil justice. Yes. Although civil justice is time-bound, but the standard of proof when it comes to civil justice is lower. You do not have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. You can prove on balance of probabilities. It probably also offers more to the survivor because you can ask for damages, you can ask for compensation, some of which are limited under the criminal justice system. So we need to maintain that shift. We need to have professional women's organizations that are offering, such legal support and, reshaping how we conceptualize accessing justice. It doesn't mean that the offenders did not offend, in terms of committing a crime, but it also means that we do not put all our eggs in one basket. And the case I always like to draw to is the case of Oj Simpson.
Yes.
We all recall that the state couldn't get a criminal conviction in
but
the
they got a civil
court.
one. Yes.
But they were able to get a civil, the civil action in their favor. And I think that's better than absolutely nothing.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, the other point I wanted you to just touch on briefly is the issue of funding to ensure that the prosecutions actually occur. I think funding is a big issue for many of the victims. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, funding when it comes to prosecution, we will usually use the word prosecution for the criminal cases. That is actually the state. And what we could do is, there's nothing stopping us having a public-private partnership initiative that helps the state to build its resources, maybe witness fund, and experts like forensic experts,
Absolutely.
And things like that. So there could be public-private if we reckon that maybe the state just...
I think, Prof, that's a key issue. I really think that's a key issue. That's why a lot of the prosecutions don't, see the light of day. The victims don't have the funds and the states have limited resources. So it just dies a natural death, So thank you. I mean, we're going to take a short break now, Prof, to listen to one of the 12 critical areas for action and concern from the Beijing Platform for Action. And we'll be right back, so stay with us.
Okay, then.
The 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action flagged 12 key areas where urgent action was needed to ensure greater equality and opportunities for women and men, girls and boys. It also laid out concrete ways for countries to bring about change. UN Women works with governments and partners to ensure such change is real for women and girls around the world. Critical area of concern number 5, women and armed conflict. Wars and armed conflict destroy families and societies and leave women and girls particularly vulnerable. Sexual violence is widespread and often used as a war tactic. UN Women's program is on women, peace and security, engage women in all aspects of negotiations, peace building, and reconstruction to build inclusive societies. We train peacekeepers to detect, address, and stop conflict-related sexual violence, while also supporting the reform of justice and security institutions, and ensuring that public services are fully responsive to women's needs.
And that was one of the critical areas of concern from the Beijing Platform for Action. So back to our conversation. We're having a very, very rich conversation. I just want to remind our listeners that I am in conversation with a very, very special personality, very important personality indeed, in the person of Professor Atsenuwa, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Lagos, a legal scholar and gender activist. Thank you, Prof, for being with us. So I'm just going to segue into, the conversation, continue the conversation we've been having. As you know, it is a man's world. And the reality is that we cannot make meaningful progress in the fight to achieve gender equality until we change the mindsets of our male counterparts and have more he for she's. How can we, Prof, address the cultural limitations that we have, the unconscious biases, and the negative stereotypes? What can be done in academic institutions such as yours to address this?
I think that one thing that we need to do is we definitely need to structure formal training or awareness programs, and deploy them, systematically rather than haphazard. So, for example, if I've thought that we can, for example, have short courses on gender equity, and students have to do online, and, they can only proceed to the next module if they have finished one module. Now, my thesis is that it is not, you're not sure that you definitely cannot convert everybody who gets exposed to that short course, but you can at least begin to tweak their understanding. Yes. You might get some converts along the line, but you throw out information that might undermine some of the principles that they are holding on to very rigidly. So I think that's what we need to do at all levels. We need to engage I tend to imagine that these days we're not engaging with the other sector as much as we used to maybe in the early days of civil society in Nigeria, engaging with people on the streets, people in, for example, market women, market men. You can imagine if we had a focus group discussion with the Butchers Association, and we engage, and we also need to find, the local language equivalent of some of the concepts we bandy. So we talk about gender equity, gender equality, and all of those things. And all too often, when you even want to engage with people, you do not have, succinct phrases or words in the local languages that communicate the same sense as you have it when we're speaking to ourselves, we who know when we're speaking to ourselves. So I think that the first step is to actually deploy a lot of information, awareness creation programming. I have asked myself over and over again that if the amount of information that came out on coronavirus was the same kind of information we got out on gender equity and equality, I'm sure our world will not be the same. The trouble with the nature of the virus, how it's transmitted on paper, it's in everybody's face, on radio, but we've never been able to harness the resources for, breaking down the barriers when it comes. So, of course, I know that the gender policy is there for strategic engagement, but of course, it needs a lot of funding to implement it. Every time I just look and I think, I wish this was gender we were talking about, I'm breaking it down this much and showing people how this is not something from outer space. This is not something new. Women have always rallied around their interests. They did in pre-colonial times. They did in colonial times, because they have always recognized that in society, they are somewhat discriminated against. There's always been, I recall that there was a thesis that Professor Jadesola Akonde held on to very firmly, and that is the institution of the Ayodele, for example. She argued that it was so prominent in the political governance of Yoruba states that even though she was one woman, it was like decisions could not be made in her absence. And women also had that one person who they knew was going to represent.
One single strong point of reference, yes.
And amongst the women, we have a lot of information about how women, challenged things that were inimical to their interests. We hear about women protesting bare-chested. We hear about women, sitting on men protests, and things like that. So really, it is a myth to imagine that the world has never, ever seen this and that we are only just trying to disrupt society because we are, internalizing foreign ideas. Every human being is going to take some political action, to resist oppression and subordination. And clearly that is all that we are trying to do. And if we help men understand, that this is how it plays out. These are the, for example, if we do the political economy of gender equality and we're able to show the statistics, like I said to young men, there is no young man who really wants to marry, in quote, a woman who is not economically empowered, because they quite understand that if their wife is economically empowered, it advantages their family. But at the same time, they're not translating that to understand that that's exactly what, the larger struggle is about, so that you get someone who together as partners, you can work for, self-actualization, yours and also that other person's. And it all builds up.
I really like, your comparison to the way and manner in which, the coronavirus matter has been tackled and the whole communication and PR, machinery that has been deployed to address that issue. And that's simply because it was seen as a life and death issue. And, honestly, I believe that, and that is what people don't seem to understand, because it doesn't look as if, the gender equality conversation is a disease. But the truth is, it is a life and death issue when you think you want to, run your economy on with 50% of the population. It doesn't make any sense, which is why we're where we are, socially and economically, as a nation. And I think, it's that lack of understanding, lack of prioritization that has left us where we are. And we really need to do something to create that awakening. And that brings me to this. So the academic institutions have their role, civil society has its role, government has its role. Private sector can really help us, to, champion this with some development institutions. Do you have any quick thoughts on that? And whilst you're talking about that, I just thought this is an opportune moment to just, also highlight, the recent constitution of some of our educational councils in, a number of our universities where, they've set up these councils and not one single female is represented. I mean, how can that be justified in 2021? Prof.
Indeed, how can that be justified? How could that have been an oversight? But what it tells you is that in the equation, and that is why we need to understand that the gender struggle is also a political struggle, and that the key word is struggle.
It's a struggle.
When the men are struggling for a bite of the cake, a piece of the cake, at that point in time, they're not being altruistic. It's all about, everybody wants a piece of that cake, and it's like, that is a non-issue. But it's pretty unfortunate that in spite of, the constitutional provisions, in spite of, the gender policy, in spite of the commitments of government in terms of political statements, to promoting women's participation in governance, in decision-making, not just in partisan politics and politics generally, we could still be where we find ourselves in April 2021. How that skipped anybody, if I try to make excuses, is appalling. Or how that could have been ignored if it was stuck before anyone is unfortunate. We're talking of over almost 100 institutions with about 4 or 5 persons, and yet you didn't have females. It is so worrisome. It is so worrisome, and I think that it is something that the federal government should actually pull back and apologize. They should. And this explains why some of us are advocating that in the current constitutional review process, there has to be a constitutional clause that insists, that states that no gender in the composition, in the appointments at any level of government, no gender should have more than 2/3. I think it's in the same way, you will see that care is taken to reflect all the states, to make sure the states are well represented because of the character principle. We have proposed that the federal character principle in Section 17, and it is something I'm very, very big on, and should actually be reviewed and revised to include, not just, the character of Nigeria is not just in terms of ethnicity and state of origin. It's also on the issue of gender. And in my view is no gender in any appointment, no gender should be more than 2/3. That way we will have the minimum 1/3. We also do not want a situation where a body that is generally perceived to be, gender specific, let's imagine that were possible. We also do not want a situation where we have no men, so I think that the time is right. I think that this is an illustration of why we need specificity in the constitutional provision.
Absolutely.
If we had that, this would not have happened, because the same way as in the composition, care was taken to ensure that every state had representation, care would have been taken to ensure that of all the appointees, we have a minimum of the other gender at the minimum, which is not really the best that we aspire to, but at the minimum. And I think I lost the first part of the question because I took the second part first.
Well, I think, Prof, you've covered everything. I think initially, in that second part was, how do you think we can address the cultural limitations, the unconscious biases, and the negative stereotypes, which is all part of the same issue, really.
And I think you also asked me about the role for the private sector.
Yes, the role for the private sector.
I think the private sector has started to take tentative steps, but the private sector needs to do more. I would like to see the private sector actually, begin to adopt, like a compact, some compact in the sector that actually lays down some basic standards for, reflecting gender equity. We find a lot of organizations doing some things, but we need to have a little bit, and we need to build it into a whole. So looking at some years ago, the United Nations had what they call the Global Compact, and, state countries and, partners all, signed up to the Global Compact. I would love to see, maybe under the auspice of the NESG, with auspice of the manufacturers, association, and all that, we begin to look at a global compact that seeks to, what will we do to ensure that on the inside, as organizations, we send a consistent message that we stand up for gender equality. What would we do to support government? What would we do to support development partners? We've been talking about sexual harassment for some time, but I do not know how many of our organizations in the private sector actually have, their own institutional policies specifically addressing all those issues. And we have gone beyond those days when we will say, we have the staff handbook, like we used to say in the university. Yeah. We have the policy, everything is right, nobody is discriminated against. No, we have since learned, and that is what research has elicited, that you can have excellent frameworks, legal and policy frameworks, but underneath, you find out that much has not changed. Yes. If you continue to, highlight your frameworks, then you're really deceiving yourself. So I think it's important that we have a global compact from that sector that says, what are we going to do within ourselves? What are we going to do to partner with government? What are we going to do to partner with civil society in such a way that we gain, every group of all the actors come together, we gain traction on what it is that we're doing, and we push forward. Clearly, we could use a lot of financial giving from the private sector to that area.
I think I'm aware that the UN Women has what they call the Women Empowerment Principles, which they're now trying to deploy, and they're engaging, civil society organizations such as WISCAR and, some other women organizations to also try and engage the private sector to sign up to those women empowerment frameworks and principles to do exactly what you have described. But honestly, the situation in the country, we really need to accelerate, and we need to ensure that things change. A final question.
Can I just say, something I've also always said is that, can we ask the private sector to maybe commit a percentage of what they commit to sports promotion, to gender equality, even if not all. You can imagine if we say, okay, you give this much to that. Can you also commit to giving just a percentage? So in which case it's like, if you give 200 million to maybe football in 1 year or some sporting activity, can you give 10% of that to, gender? And that way, we begin to help them, because clearly they're not likely to think in terms of committing that much money, because businesses are in business to make profit. And also often gender equity issues do not immediately translate to profit.
It does actually. It does, Prof. That's a mistake. I mean,
I said immediately. Immediately. So it's really important that we do the push that helps them, like you said, get to where they see it visibly, the impact, and then they know that, gender equality supports business to grow.
Well, I think it's up to us to make the case. Private institutions, as you say, have been created to, meet the requirements of their shareholders and stakeholders. But we can make the ask, and I think people are making the ask. But I like the slant you've put on it to actually, begin to say, why don't you think about your corporate social responsibility budget in XYZ terms, and look at it holistically and say that we ensure we do XYZ annually. I think that's a great one. Something I'm going to take up. Thank you for that, Prof. Finally, Prof, to bring, the conversation back to the reason why we're here today, which is all about the book which we're about to release, which is the Sheroes of Beijing, and your excellent contribution as an author to that book. You did make an insightful statement in the book when you said, and I quote, "Human is not male, but male and female. And, indeed, all human beings, both male and female, should be respected for their differences and also for the value that they bring, and also given equal opportunity and equal access to thrive." Prof, could you, on a final note on this very rich conversation, kindly share with us some of your final thoughts on this issue?
Yes, I think that's the message we must push out to everyone from birth. It probably should be something that is like a byline. Human is male and female. And so at any time, we should always put on the lenses that asks, how does this impact the male? How does this impact the female? Not in terms of doing the other a favor, but just celebrating diversity. Every time I look at the oceans, I just think how, the massive whale, and then those flotillas, those tiny little creatures, and it is in that biodiversity that we have sustenance of life. We bring value. Each group, each person is valuable. I don't think God didn't know what he was doing. I do not excuse being female. If I cry, so be it. Crying is authentic. It is valid. How I feel, how I reason is value added. And in the same way as male ways of doing things are value added. And then we create the room for social change to take place instead of fossilizing our identities that this is woman, this is man, and it can never change. Everything that we are is somewhat a creation of a point in time. And if we will be open enough, we will see that there's room for change in a way that enhances us. Human will always be male and female.
Fantastic. Prof, it's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you this morning. Thank you so much, Professor Atsenuwa, for your insights, for your ideas, and for making time to be with us on this podcast this afternoon. Also, let me seize this opportunity to thank you specially for being a contributor to the book, The Sheroes of Beijing, and for telling your own story. We are indeed very, very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure being with you too. It's been great fun. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sheroes of Beijing podcast series. For more insights, follow us up across our social media handles. Follow UN Women on Twitter at UN Women Nigeria. Follow WISCAR on Instagram at WISCARNG and WISCAR Nigeria on Facebook and LinkedIn, or at Africa Business Radio.